delighted to have you. It's our community, and I'm Mary Davidson. We have, I never cease to be amazed at our neighbors. Today we have someone that, we just never would have a chance to meet, and I'm so delighted to have him. His name is Major Harvey Bayless, and Major Bayless is United States Air Force retired, and with him is Captain George J. Dunmore, Army Reserve retired. And Captain Dunmore and Major Bayless are here to discuss with us the Tuskegee Airmen. And Major Bayless is a Tuskegee Airman. And I think, there's always an aura of great respect, Major Bayless, attached to the whole group of Tuskegee Airmen for all that they did and for all that they still do. So I say that that's a special place that you hold in the history of this country. You describe yourself as the wind beneath the aircraft for the Tuskegee Airmen. What did you mean by that?
Well, we look upon the ground force. We keep the pilots flying, and that's the job. And we looked upon that as a 7-day a week, 24 hours a day, and all these missions that our pilots performed in their various aircraft, the people on the ground were the ones that got them up there. So we looked upon ourselves as someone below the wings, like the wind, making certain that they're flying properly.
Well, I need to tell you also that Major Bayless is a physicist by training and a mathematician, and shouldered a great deal of responsibility, because I think that ground personnel had the responsibility for seeing to it that everything operated at tip-top on those airplanes, because that was big. Did you enlist, or were you drafted?
I was drafted.
And how did you feel about that? This was 1941?
Well, I was, at that time, I had was attending a technical school at Wilberforce University in radio technology. And if the war brought up the idea that there should be some jobs available in the government. So I looked upon the fact that give me an opportunity to play a part.
And you played a big part. You said, now the War Department in 1941, and that was before the armed forces were integrated, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, but the War Department felt rather uncomfortable about enlisted personnel and service aircraft flown by black aviators. So the white service personnel didn't service for the black aviators, and you said that was a blessing in disguise.
It was a blessing in disguise in the sense that we had to train black individuals to perform work as mechanics, communication specialists, armament specialists, positions that most African Americans had not trained on before. So it gave them an opportunity to have a group of individuals prepared to do all aspects of servicing of an aircraft.
Well, I want to know, I have a picture of you, or a picture of a very handsome young man taken in 1941. That was, you were a very handsome rascal in 1941.
Well, I think that was 1944.
Was that 44?
44.
Well, you were maturing by that time.
Thank you.
What was the attitude of, how did you feel about the attitude of the Army Air Corps toward black aviators? How did,
well, I feel that they were skeptical as to whether the blacks really had the education, the ability to fly planes proficiently in combat. But I feel that the result of the training they got at Tuskegee and the service they performed overseas and the various missions, especially when they got into the 15th Air Force, where they were we were providing escort service. And at that time our planes had changed. We started out with P-40s, which were handovers from the flyers that flew with the Chinese in China and India, and suddenly when we got into the 15th Air Force in May of 1944, we picked up the P-51. On the way, we had the P-47. So once we got those top aircraft, we felt like that we
Isn't that interesting? And I would venture to suggest to you that the Tuskegee Airmen felt that they had to be the best, so they tried really harder than a lot of the others.
Well, I think part of that stems from the standpoint of our commander. B.O. Davis was a West Pointer. He was the first African American West Pointer in the 19th century, and he instilled a sense of discipline in the individuals.
What kind of a guy was he?
Well,
How would you?
Well, I didn't know him very well until I got back from overseas. I was in a support group, but he was firm but fair, and I think he.
And accepted nothing less than your best.
Well, but he installed a lot of responsibility into the pilots.
Talk about the red tail angels of the 332nd. The red tails.
Well, when we got into the 15th Air Force, there were 7 fighter groups in the 15th Air Force, and they all had distinctive coloring on their tails, on their aft of the fuselage, and we ended up picking up the red paint, and we had the red tails, and it become a distinctive symbol. And then as we become more proficient and did a wonderful job, many of the bomber crews would ask for if they had to have escort. They say we would like to have those Tuskegee Airmen. In that fact, many of them probably weren't even aware that they were black. They just said that's a good group of guys that's doing a job.
And isn't it interesting? They did such a good job that, and all of these things help because the Tuskegee Airmen, I think, have been very important in equality, the whole issue of racial equality, because the job that they did was outstanding. Don't you think so?
Yes, but when you're in a war, as Hap Arnold would say, let's fight the war first, and then we'll worry about equality at the end. So the mere fact that blacks, when I went overseas from Fort Cap Patrick Henry in 1945, 44, they wouldn't like many of the African Americans attend the theater, and yet there were German prisoners of war and Italian prisoners of war. So you wonder really what this idea of equality was going to be about and when we would be able to participate.
Well, you know, an interesting intervention occurred, and that was in the person of Eleanor Roosevelt. And she she came to where the Tuskegee Airmen were training it. Chief Anderson took her on a flight.
Yes.
Talk about that a little bit.
Well, it was very. She decided she wanted to fly. And that time they were in training her airplanes and aircraft, and she had to get her staff. They said we don't know whether President Roosevelt is going to allow that or not. So they called back, and he said anything Eleanor wants to do, Eleanor does. So she flew with.
And Chief Anderson was a pilot.
Yes, he had been. They had obtained him on the program from Howard University. They had a civil air patrol program.
Oh, and he was a student at Howard?
He was training with Howard University, and there was more money available at Tuskegee, so he transferred to, and with some other African American pilots.
Well, and I know that the Tuskegee Airmen needed an airfield, and she arranged, as I read, for $175,000, which doesn't seem like a lot now, but it was then, to purchase the land for Moton Field.
Yes, and they were able to build the airfield there, and then associated with it, the military had the Tuskegee Airmen Flying Field. There were 2 fields there.
And wasn't it Captain Ben Davis that commanded the Tuskegee airfield?
No, you see, the Tuskegee Army flying field was commanded by it was a white major.
Well, was Benjamin Davis?
He was one of the trainees. He was the only one that had that was commissioned.
Uh-huh.
The others were cadets.
Well,
he was a captain.
He was, and he became a general.
He became a general. That's right. After the war.
Yeah. Did you ever meet him?
Sure, I knew Ben Davis.
What kind of a guy was he?
Well, as I say, he was a disciplinarian. He was very straightforward, handsome fella, and he was, I think, the man for the job.
Isn't that
I don't think that the Tuskegee Airmen could have survived without someone who understood their plight, their problems, and he was able to say, here's what we need to do to become a success.
Well, and on the other side of that, because he was of his rank, he was able to work, as they say, both sides of the street.
Well, he didn't have that much rank. I don't know if you realize it or not. He, as a captain, he went from captain to a lieutenant colonel, but he took the 99th over in May of 1943. Then he came back later and brought over the 332nd. Then he went from a lieutenant colonel to colonel, but he never did have a lot of rank from the standpoint that, well, no one did in a sense.
That's right. Well, at that time you were not. What was your rank at that time?
At that time, I went in the service as a private, and I had got promoted to a technical sergeant, and then in 1945, as the war was ending, I was offered the opportunity to obtain a commission. So I was one of 4 African Americans that went before a board to get my commission. And it was very interesting because as I went before the board, I kind of stumbled into the room and I said, gee, they're going to say this clumsy person is not eligible for anything. But I was lucky. The chairman of the board was from Ohio, and he says, do you know anything about Ohio? When I told him, well, because he's questioned me, and I said, yes, they won the Big Ten championship in 1943. And he laughed, and I knew that I had someone on the board who was for me. At that time, there was not a big effort to commission African Americans. In fact, we're out of about 900,000 African Americans in the Air Force. During World War II, there were only 4. I was one of the 4 that got a field commission. So I felt good about that.
Felt more than good. You have had a very distinguished career. And when you got that commission, what was your rank at that point?
I was a technical sergeant.
No,
at
but
20.
Then when you got the commission, you became a
second lieutenant.
Second lieutenant. And then how did you get to be the major?
Well, then I got a major after I was in the Korean War, and that time I got promoted to captain, and then when I got out, they promoted me to major.
See, I just think that's... Was the war in Korea, how would you contrast those two wars?
The big contrast. World War II, I was part of a segregated force. In the Korean War, the Air Force was the first of the services to integrate. And I was very fortunate that I happened to be in the Air Force. And second, I had done some work. I was working in the Rome Air Development Center. So I went into service. They sent me to Hawaii. I was on my way to Korea as a communications officer, but the radar didn't work. And they said, okay, we'll get you. And I went out and got the radar working, 2 of the CPS-1, CPS-5. And they said, well, you're set for life. And I kind of liked the duty because I only had duty from about 6 o'clock in the evening to about 2 in the morning. The rest of the time, we could only service them when they weren't using it. So I felt good about being in the Air Force where I was an individual. And I had at the time had to work with Army and Navy units that had not integrated.
So there was a big difference in those as far as you were concerned. I think that's
well, they were grudgingly accepting the fact.
Yeah.
But if you do your job, and I always felt that with the Air Force, I was one of the, at that time I was just a first lieutenant at the 1500 Air Transport Command headquarters, and I was the only first lieutenant there. They wouldn't normally let anyone be billeted there unless you're at least a captain. But they needed my expertise.
It was that radar that did it.
That's right.
I think that's wonderful. Let me ask you that another person that comes to mind as I read about the Tuskegee Airmen was Major Noel Parrish.
All right, Major Noel Parrish.
Talk about him.
He was the commander. You know what, you were asking about the commander.
Yes.
He was the commander of Tuskegee Army Flying Field, and he was individual originally from Kentucky, and he really supported the Tuskegee Airmen and their goals and objectives.
Because he was, I would suggest to you that he was very important in the continuation and the spot that the Tuskegee Airmen were able to obtain.
Well, it represented a white officer saying, look, these fellows can do as good a job as the other. As any, the black officers and the white officers, as far as I'm concerned, once they get this training, they're the same. You know, same proficiency. And if they have the heart to go out and fight, then they can do a good job. And he really supported them.
And he was right. He was right. Some of the other Tuskegee Airmen that come to mind as outstanding, who comes to mind? Who was a special friend of yours? Or?
Well, B.O. Davis's deputy, Spanky Roberts. Spanky Roberts was the commander when B.O. Davis left Italy to go back to pick up from the 99th Squadron to pick up the 332nd. Spanky Roberts, who at that time was just a major, he commanded this squadron, and at Anzio, the statement was that the Tuskegee Airmen were worthless. We'd only had one enemy kill in 6 months, and there was a lot of talk among the white officers that we're just wasting their time on those fellows. And they went out, and the Germans would not engage in combat, but at Anzio, they brought out their top flyers, and we shot down 5 of the German fighters in the first day, and then second day we shot down 7. And the atmosphere changed from there. You know, they said these fellows are...
But all of the Tuskegee Airmen didn't make it. You had some casualties too.
Well, on all of these engagements, you had casualties in combat, and you also had a lot of casualties in training. One of the casualties I'd like to speak of is Lieutenant Sadaf Say. He was an officer who lost his life in training over Lake Huron. He had he had a P-40 that one of the old P-40s said they weren't. Well, they were not in good shape, and he had to bail out over Lake Huron in April, and the water's still cold there. And I was part of a communications group that tried to set up rescue, but he was a graduate of Syracuse University, and he had starred in football, track, and in baseball. So Syracuse recognized me and Sadat Stain as 2 of their honored guests. So in the Syracuse Alumni Journal, they have an article on both of us, their contributions that these 2 individuals made to the
And you went to Syracuse under the GI Bill, didn't you?
I went to under GI Bill. Yeah. After the war,
yeah.
I came back and went to, it took me 7 years to get a
That's okay,
degree.
You got a physics degree.
Mm-hmm.
That was good going. Now, 1948 kind of changed things because President Truman ended the segregation in the military. What did you think about that? And how did that seem to change the whole complexion of the military?
At that time, in 1949, all the services says, okay, if you've accepted a commission in the reserves, then you're going to have to start performing some type of reserve duty. Mm-hmm. And at that time, my reserve duty, and I was working at the Rome Air Development Center, and reserve duty with those other officers first time I was really part of a group that was without regard to race, creed, or color. I was the only black in about 200 officers.
And probably nobody paid any attention.
Well, they just looked upon me as another individual.
That's
I had the lowest rank because I had this and got promoted after.
That would have been the what
so if
segregated
any work
you.
to be done,
Yeah,
they said, let's
yeah.
give it to Lieutenant Bayless.
Yeah.
But I felt good that I was part of a group that was working towards a common goal.
And that's the whole bottom line, is it
Yes.
not?
So I think Harry Truman deserves a lot of respect.
You know, I read a biography of, and he wrote to his mother every day. And when he, in 1948, when he signed the bill ending segregation in the armed services, he wrote to his mother and he said, "Mama, I know you wouldn't approve, but I did what I thought was right." And I think he did do what he thought was right, and he always did. So I think he deserves a lot of credit.
Well, yes, and I would like to. Harry Truman went over. President Truman went over to Russia, and then while he was talking to Joe Stalin, he says, "Joe, you need to integrate. You need to have voting. Everybody needs to be able to vote for who they want to have lead them, and you need a democratic regime here." And Stalin spoke up and he says, "Well, look, my military are integrated." So I think that affected Harry Truman, because early in his life, I feel that he was not the most liberal person
Oh,
in the
I think
world.
that's right. And his mother definitely wasn't. So
Yes.
that's why he said, "Mama, I don't think you'd approve, but I did what I thought was
right.
right." And he did. Captain Dunmore, would you, in 2007, President Bush issued the Congressional Gold Medal, talk about, to the Tuskegee Airmen, and we can show them. You brought one, and we can show it to them. Will you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I tell people the touching thing that I got was I happened to catch it on CNN, and he saluted the Tuskegee Airmen. And the significance of that was he was returning a salute that they had not received, because prior to that, a lot of the Tuskegee Airmen did not get salutes from their white counterparts. So to me, it was a touching symbol.
Well, and that medal is so beautiful because it shows profiles of the Tuskegee Airmen, and I think it's a beautiful medal. Did each one of them get one?
All of the documented
Tuskegee.
Tuskegee Airmen, plus the fact either widows or next of kin, for some of the what we call documented Tuskegee Airmen who had who were deceased. So we wanted to make sure that the family got the medal.
Well, and I want to extend, and I know that you are not a Tuskegee Airman, but you are active in the organization, the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated. Why was that organization formed?
Well, my understanding was that the pilots used to get together, and then finally they decided that they should include everybody because we want the tradition of the Tuskegee Airmen not to be forgotten.
In the local chapter, how many of them are there left?
I think we have six. Original Tuskegee Airmen, including Colonel McGee, who was a member of our chapter, even though he lives in Bethesda, Maryland. But he was one of our founders, and he's kept his membership
Isn't
with
that,
us.
that's nice. And you served with all these six
Yes,
people.
yes.
And do any of them come to mind as, do you know, if I'm looking for funny stories or any kind of something that you remember of those days in the Air Force that make you smile a little bit today?
Well, there's a lot of camaraderie with the pilots and the ground people, and I never forget that I had some of the individuals when I was going to attending Wilberforce Radio School who become pilots and oversee. I'm here. I'm a tech sergeant there, an officer, but about once every other month we'd get together, and I had that for the Wilberforce group. So I had about 3 or 4 of the officers come by, and I had made arrangements with our local cook to cooked 1 or 2 chickens and then went out and got some Italian wine, and we had a big day. And then I got some pecans. They had a lot of pecans over there, and so we're still friendly. Paul Green, he went up to become he lives out in California. He's a full colonel. And Kimbrough, most of these individuals were just in the war helped them out because it gave them a mission in life, and they went on to pursue careers that they would never have done if they hadn't had the benefit of the training in the military service.
What did some of them do?
Beg pardon?
What did some of them do? What did they choose as careers after they got
Well,
out?
we had one, Lee Archer. He was one of the vice presidents of a corporation in New York, and he's supposed to be one of our reported aces during World War II. And we had the individual who was the mayor of Detroit. What was his name?
Coleman Young.
Coleman Young.
Was he a Tuskegee Airman? I didn't know
was a
that.
Tuskegee
I didn't
Airman.
know that. I did not.
And Bruce Watkins, local person. You've heard of Bruce
Well,
Watkins?
sure. Was he?
Well, no, Bruce Watkins was a navigator.
I
But he
didn't-
was also a member of the Tuskegee
See,
organization.
I did not know that either.
Yes. They have some streets named after him.
Yes, yes, they do. And he was a fine man. He truly was.
Uh-huh.
And what did you do when you got out of the Air Force?
Well, when I got out of the service, I went back to work as a radio mechanic at Rome Air Force Depot. And then when they brought the Rome Air Development Center in, I was going to school then, and I got transferred over to that and promoted to where I was more of a engineering aide. And then when the war started, at that time I was going to school. When I came back, I was able to get my degree, and I ended up being a supervisory electronic engineer. In fact, the Air Force gave me a distinctive service medal for some of the engineering work I did in setting up communication systems all over the world for Department of Defense and the Air Force.
That's amazing.
So I had approximately 39 years of service in the military and also in civil service.
Now, do all the good old boys from the Tuskegee Airmen's group keep in touch? You keep in touch with the ones that are still alive?
And not too many of the ones I know are still alive. I keep a record. and I have a friend of mine who got out of the 4 African Americans that were direct commissions in World War II. One of them is Johnny Rice, and he's in a nursing home, and I call his wife up about once a month, and she goes visit him, and she'll relay the message to me.
But those friendships that you made have been long-lasting.
Well, they have been, but they're, as I said, I'm about the only leaf on the tree.
Well, you're quite a leaf, I do have to
Thank
say, because you told me that you didn't even wear glasses. I said, that's not fair. But you know, I have to say thank you, George Dunmore, but a special thanks to you, Major Bayless, because you are truly an outstanding man. It has been my honor to meet you and to have you. And I think that, as I would say to you, that I'm so glad you could join us to meet these 2 fine gentlemen and to meet Major Bayless. Now and always, Major, the Tuskegee Airmen and their organization will stand up and say, all men are indeed created equal. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for coming. Thank you. We'll see you again soon.